I want to look at a number of ways that a theme of universalism pervades the liturgy for Thy Holy Days, particularly for Rosh Hashanah. The best known one is the way the holiday is celebrated as a commemoration of history. The three pilgrimage festivals commemorate events in the history of the Jewish people. Pesach commemorates our liberation from slavery and our leaving Egypt. Shavuot commemorates our receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. And Sukkot commemorates our 40 years in the wilderness. Those are all events specific to the Jewish people. On Rosh Hashanah, by contrast, we say, Hayom Harat Olam. Today, the universe was created. This is the commemoration of an event in the history of the whole world. In each of the Amidah prayers for Rosh Hashanah and for Yom Kippur, there's a series of 3 paragraphs, each beginning Uvchein. The first asks God to set his fear over all his creatures, his awe over all that he made, so that all people would be united under God's rule to do his will. The second asks God to set his glory on his people, Israel, and asks that there be joy for his land and city. Simcha la'artzecha v'sason li'irecha. And the third expresses hope that the righteous will rejoice and sing, that evil will vanish like smoke when God will remove evil government from the world. The first paragraph, with its drumbeat repetition of kol, all, is about God's universal sovereignty, saying nothing about us as a people. The second paragraph then focuses inward. We hope for God's recognition of our special status and our role. And the third paragraph then returns to the universal. We hope for the triumph of righteousness in general, again, with no specific reference to us. Starting with the universal and ending there shows that that's where the overall emphasis lies. The focus in the second paragraph on us is only as a way station to return to the universal. It may be suggesting that part of our role as God's special people is precisely to pave the way towards that universal acknowledgement of God's role. The centerpiece of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf is the sections of verses of Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot. God's kingship, his remembering, and shofar. And these 3 themes recur throughout the day. The prayers bracketing the verses in these sections elaborate on their themes. Malchiot looks broadly and universally. It asks God to establish his sovereignty over all inhabitants of the world. Zichronot then focuses narrowly and particularly. It affirms God's having in mind each individual person, both to avail that person in time of need and to judge that person's deeds. And it asks God to keep in mind the merits of Israel's ancestors and his covenant with them. The Shofrot then mentions the blowing of the shofar at the time of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai and at the time of the ultimate messianic redemption. It mentions Israel, but it says that all people trembled in awe at the time of the revelation of Sinai, and the coming of the Mashiach is an event of cosmic and not just national importance. So here also there is a fluctuation from universal to particular national and then to an ultimate redemption that affects both Israel and the world in general. The primary mitzvah of the day, and a focus both of the Torah service and of Musaf, is the blowing of the shofar. We blow shofar many times on Rosh Hashanah, and each time involves a small unit of several notes, a tkiyah, a shvarim, or a tu'ah, and another tkiyah. That sequence from the long sustained note of the tkiyah to the series of broken notes that are the shvarim or the tu'ah, back to the long tkiyah, can be seen as going from solid, outward-looking confidence to fragmentation and looking inward, and then back to well-being. That sequence structurally resembles, and it reinforces, the sequence from universal to particular to universal in the Uvachein paragraphs and in the Malchiyot Zichronot Shofrot. That tension of universal and particular can be seen even in the Torah readings for the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. On the first day, we read about the birth of Yitzhak, and on the second day, we read the Akedah, the binding of Yitzhak. There are many ways of seeing each of these readings. One way sees them as repeating these themes of the universal and the particular. The first day's reading begins, Hashem pakad et Sarah. God took note of Sarah. This is like the language of the Zichronot verses. God has in mind the specific individual in his or her difficulties. God relieves Sarah's barrenness, and he brings a successor to Avraham as the father of the Jewish people. The second day's reading, the Akedah, is of course important in the career of Avraham, but it is also a terrifying manifestation of a God who is seemingly remote. This is not God in his intimate and protective relationship with the Jewish people or with particular individuals. This is the God in his remote, transcendent nature that is universal and not specific to any people. The last blessing of the Amidah, the one for peace, ends, Amevalech et amo Yisrael b'shalom, God who blesses his people Israel with peace. That formula, which focuses specifically on the Jewish people, is used all year long. In some congregations, including Or Kodesh, it's also used during the High Holy Days. However, in most Ashkenazi congregations in the diaspora, the formula is changed to Oseh HaShalom, God who makes peace. During the holidays that are about the birth of the universe, rather than about events in the history of the Jewish people in particular, that piece of the liturgy changes from national peace to universal peace. These elements of the liturgy do not align precisely. They are more in the nature of a theme and variations. The alternative form of the Amidah blessings substitutes universal peace for the specifically national peace. The Torah readings take us from the individual and the particular national drama of the birth of a son to our mother Sarah on the first day to the second day's drama of Avraham, not so much as Jew, but as the universal human vis-a-vis the absolute authority of God. In the other elements, there's a fluctuation or a dialectic. Uvachein takes us from God's universal rule to the Jewish people's special role, and then back to the universality of the messianic redemption. Malchiyot, Zichronot, and Shofrot make the same journey, but focusing on the particularity of the individual and our individual redemption in the end of times. The notes of the shofar take us from wholeness to fragmentation and back to a renewed and strengthened wholeness. Taken as a whole, what these aspects of our liturgy may be suggesting is that what we celebrate on Rosh Hashanah is our humanity and not our Jewishness. Or perhaps more precisely, it's what we as Jews can contribute to the universal messianic redemption. May you and all the world be inscribed for a good year.